or whether or not it just kind of implodes into a new Maoist tyranny. And honestly, I can't tell you which one is more likely right now. Both of them are very solid options. There's two big things going on. And a lot of little things, but let's just focus on the two big things for now. First, China is the country on the planet whose way of life and whose economy is most dependent upon the United States cooperating. The United States is the country that makes globalization possible. We changed the way the world worked after World War II and allowed countries to go anywhere and interact with anyone else and participate in any supply chain and buy any commodity and sell to any market. If the United States goes home, which is what the last four presidents have been working towards, then the Chinese system loses the ability to import oil and raw materials and the ability to export finished goods. That means it falls into a pre-industrial state because China utterly lacks the military capacity to displace the United States on the global oceans. There are not enough resources and markets within reach of China. It is utterly dependent upon the Americans maintaining the world in the shape that it is in right now. And if we get real hostility between Beijing and Washington, it's over. And it's over in less than a year.
Is that really
Absolutely.
right?
And I'd actually argue that the U.S. already has cut it off. The troops have come home. Most of the naval deployments to places like the Persian Gulf have stopped. So all it takes is one match being lit by one player anywhere in the world. And since China is the most exposed power, China is the country that will fall first and hardest. Now, it might be an overstatement to say that they've all had the same goal, but they've certainly had the same attitude that the international world is something they really don't want to deal with. So Bill Clinton only met with foreign leaders, for summits, and he only started looking into foreign policy like 24 hours before the summit. And his interpersonal skills were great. The summits went well, but then there was never any follow-up. W fought the wars in the Middle East, and so it was one policy all the time and to hell with everything else. Obama didn't like to meet with anyone, and so we really didn't have foreign policy for 8 years. And then we had Trump, who was antithetical to all things international. And now we have Biden, who basically is the Trump's policy with a smile, different stationery, and a better grammar check. Well, the U.S. military is going through what's the best way to phrase this? A bit of a crisis of identity. They haven't gotten reasonable updated guidance from the president since George Herbert Walker Bush. And so they're working with an old playbook, but the world's changed in the last 30 years. So they've been told that they need to be able to fight a major naval conflict within sight of the Asian mainland. Well, that's not feasible today. And so if they're going to meet their current battle plans, yes, they need 5 times as many ships as they have right now. That's silly. They need a new battle plan, which means they need new guidance from the top. And I have a hard time believing that if we actually got into a shooting war with the Chinese, that we'd sail an aircraft carrier right up into the envelope of every weapon systems that the Chinese have. We'd stand back, we'd be behind the first island chain where we're out of range of all of their weapon systems. And then we basically spend a few days sinking every Chinese vessel that was outside of the first island chain. And then we'd start doing some dynamite fishing within it. But, honestly, if it comes to a war with China, you send 2 or 3 destroyers to the Indian Ocean and you cut the energy import flow, and China collapses on its own in less than 2 months. This is not a hard conflict. It was, far more involved with that. We kept the world safe for all commercial transport. Mm-hmm. And part of what made the global system work from 1945 on is Middle Eastern oil could reach global markets. So while there was definitely a terrorism and a security aspect, dominating aspect to our interventions there after 2001, a big piece of it was making sure that the oil could still flow. But between the shale revolution and a general shift in the American political spectrum, left, right, and center, towards being anti-global, those days are over. Mm-hmm. So we could theoretically have a small base in the Persian Gulf somewhere so we could shut it off whenever we want to. But it's more effective, honestly, if this is your goal. I'm not saying I'm recommending this, but if this is your goal, it's more effective to just have a few ships in the Indian Ocean basin so you can check out the tankers and see where they're going. That way you have fewer boots on the ground, less exposure, and you can hit what part of the supply chain system really matters.
All right.
Oh, pick a country. There are hundreds of individual conflicts that have not been able to boil up and catch fire because the United States has basically thrown a wet blanket on everything. So it could be Russia versus the Baltics. It could be Sweden versus Russia. It could be Denmark versus Germany. It could be Iran versus Saudi Arabia, India versus Pakistan, Vietnam versus China, China versus Taiwan, China versus Japan. If any one of these goes up, and you kind of break that glass wall between the world we have now and the world we had before, the idea that there aren't going to be more, or that the initial one isn't going to, how should I say this, expand rapidly, I think is a little bit silly. I mean, you have to assume that we have moved into a kumbaya world where everyone gets along without any sort of superpower maintaining the peace to believe that globalization is going to continue.
And
Well,
so,
I could pick apart each of those specific concerns and show how they're not false, but that's not the point. Most people believe what you believe. We're done. Now, we did globalization and we did global security in order to prevent a thermonuclear conflict, and it was successful. But the Americans do not perceive a threat on that magnitude, so they do not see the prices worth paying. And people who believe the way I believe have now lost the last 9 presidential elections. And this last round, we didn't even have someone in the race. This is not an aberration. This is a pattern. This is America. But look at how countries act when the United States doesn't force them to do otherwise. Think of how neo-imperial the Chinese are being. You really think that with the Americans gone, no one else is going to do something? Think of how the French carry out foreign policy, where it's always been France first. Think about what the Germans do with manufacturing supply chains, imposing details of policy on all of their local trading partners in order to do things their way. Every country has their own belief in how things should run in order to make their system better than others. But they can only do that if everyone else does things their way. Well, the advantage of the American-led system is we forced a certain code of conduct and a certain sort of rules that removed a series of tools of state power from the table altogether, primarily military action. With the United States gone, you have to assume that every single country will continue to abide by that rule, except for myself. So the Chinese are being more belligerent military, but they're betting that no one else will. That's a bad bet. But think about what's going to happen the next time the Indians have an energy crisis and they see all these slow-moving super tankers full of crude going to the Chinese. It would be hard for them to take any, and it's not like the Chinese can do anything about it. And you can have some version of that story in almost every part of the global ocean, particularly at the choke points. The next time that the Iranians and the Saudis get into it over Hormuz and the U.S. isn't there, what do you think is going to happen? I want to take the really cold historical view. This is actually working out really well because when the Shia majority has been in charge of Iraq, they have always screwed it up. They have always led to the collapse of the state. And so if you're willing to take a very cold anti-humanitarian view, this is perfect. They screw it up. They rule like they can, and they can't. Anyway, we're getting away from the core topic here. You want me to get into the second issue of why the Chinese are going to vanish?
sure, yeah.
So, and when I say vanish, that's the word. They are literally vanishing as a people. Everyone's familiar with the one-child policy. It worked very well. If anything, it worked incredibly too well. And after having it in place for 35 years, we have a population bomb. And as of January of this year, according to official Chinese state statistics, China was the fastest aging society in human history with the largest sex imbalance in human history. They had aged past the point that they could even theoretically maintain their population at its current size into the future. They had run out of people of childbearing age.